Hello, everyone. I'm Don Arleth, and welcome to World Today. Joining me tonight in the studio is Sergei Erofeev, I hope I got that right, who used to hold a high position in the Russian university system before emigrating for political reasons. Now he's back to his original profession of social science and has also become more politically active. Hello, Sergei, and thank you very much for joining us tonight in the studio.
Thank you, Don, for inviting me.
Absolutely. Now, could we start off with your own background? Why is it that you decided to leave Russia?
Well, I worked for a long time in the Russian university system on its internationalization while things were possible in that respect. And then, when this war started, and it started 8 years ago, with the annexation of Crimea, things started to be impossible in that area which I wanted to develop. So since then, I spent a little time, more time, finalizing the startups in Moscow, and then decided to immigrate because it was becoming not only impossible to work in the way I wanted, but it was becoming more dangerous for people like me to express my political views and communicate with people the way I wanted.
Okay, so you mentioned your opposition to the war in Ukraine. There are a lot of theories out there, but what is your theory about why has Russia launched this war against Ukraine that started all these years ago?
You know, I represent here the voice of social scientists from Russia and those who are still in Russia. And this voice is not heard enough, I'm afraid. If there were more chance to express our understanding, that would significantly help the international discourse of this war. But I will try to provide a little explanation from my point of view as a sociologist. So being not a diplomat, not a military strategist, but a social scientist, one should pay attention, first of all, to the social conditions, to the social processes which bring about certain phenomena all the way up to full-scale wars. Why Putin started this war, for me, is quite clear. Anything for a political system like that of Putinism, anything that is undertaken in the field of geopolitics, attacking other countries, playing or delivering some resemblance even over the Second World War. This is a result of internal processes. So the most important thing which brought about this war is the internal insecurity of Putin's political system. And I want to make it very, very clear. At some point, the system started to be threatened by the developing social processes in the country. And we first faced it 10 years ago with a massive protest in the streets of Moscow and other cities in Russia in defense of fair elections. After that, Putin came back as president of the country, and he felt that his support was still declining. That's what prompted him, as an opportunist, to seize the moment in 2014, during the Ukrainian political crisis, and annex Crimea. It wasn't a long time prepared action. It was a moment, an opportune moment, for him as a representative of specific political culture in order to bolster his popular support. And that worked for 2 or 3 years. And then his rating started to decline again. This also overlapped with new creativity, new political technologies applied by his major opponents, represented by Alexei Navalny. And what happened to Alexei Navalny in 2020, his assassination attempt, his resurrection, his epic return to the country, his investigation, and finally the unbelievably unfair imprisonment of this major political opponent. This further undermined the system and created new threats, even despite the fact that Navalny was in prison. The ratings continued to decline. In September 2021, Putin's party, for the first time, lost elections. Well, if you take the real numbers, not distorted by manipulation. And he felt that the situation of 2024, when he was going to be re-elected again, thanks to, changing the constitution, yet another not quite legitimate action. So fearing that that would bring about protests similar to those in Belarus with re-election of Lukashenko in 2020, he decided to take an extreme action to distract the popular attention from the real problems of the country and to just solve his internal problems. The internal problems of different kinds are always at the core.
And do you think that that strategy is so far working for him? Do you believe that Russians are actually kind of uniting around this war in Ukraine?
The Russian society was in a state of extreme shock from the very beginning. And even now, you can't really tell whether the shock has ended, and we are facing a routinization of the new state of affairs between the society and the government and the state. One thing is for sure, nobody should really take seriously the absolute numbers of opinion polls from Russia because they are drawn from totally distorted survey environment. It doesn't work like that. What is more important is to see what is the dynamics of, I wouldn't say support, but of, complacency, of conformism with what is going on. If you want me to compare the situation today with the situation 8 years ago, when Russia just started this war, the first phase of this war, with the annexation of Crimea and the fighting in Donbass, the Russian society is more divided than it was then. By many direct and indirect indicators, we can see that. And of course, the shock is much greater. It's incomparable, the situation with the shock. Many Russians are just in the state of denial. They don't want to accept the reality as it is. Not everybody, but very many people. Their whole lives are shattered in a way. Not everything has already happened in terms of economic impoverishment or losing even more rights. But these things are coming, and the situation is in progress. But just to finish my answer to your question, why Putin started this war. He started this war exactly at this moment, in February 2022, I think, because the first reason I already mentioned, the situation back home was already looking too threatening for him. Even the imprisonment of Navalny didn't quite help. Even the complete ban on public political activities didn't quite help. So he needed to unite the country around the flag and suggest that we have an extremely dangerous enemy. But also he, through years, has felt that if Ukraine develops a successful democracy and successful market economy, that will be a major second threat to his political system. So the threat number one would always be the Russian society, the Russian people. They are the enemies number one for anyone who has gone through state seizure, state capture, like that, and trying to impose the rule of a mafia on a society which otherwise could have developed along normal democratic lines. So this is number one. The internal enemy, the internal threats are at the very top. But Ukraine, it would be the threat number two, because the example of a democratic, Slavic, very close culturally society just next door is actually unbearable. The more Ukrainians would progress on the road to democracy, open society, market success, etc., the more dangerous this comparison would become for Putin and his system. So that was probably the right moment for him, 2 years before the elections of 2024, and before Ukraine becomes too strong militarily and politically and democratically. So that was a very rational step for him.
Yes, okay. Well, I've heard a lot of people say that, and I would imagine that having a free democratic society progressing right next door of the same people, essentially, right? A lot of Ukrainians share the same language and culture with Russia. You know, another significant development I find interesting in this whole situation is the amount of division that was previously. You have families that live on both sides of the border, yeah? You have families that are divided just by the fact that they live either in Ukraine or in Russia. And since this war broke out, there are families that are no longer even speaking to each other because the Russians blame the Ukrainians and believe that this war is their fault. And obviously the Ukrainians are trying to say their own opinions on why this war is happening and that they're actually being invaded. Do you find that an interesting subject as a sociologist?
Those Russians who do not speak to their younger family members who are anti-Putin or do not speak to their Ukrainian relatives, they're mostly not deeply convinced Putinists. This should be made very, very clear. These are the people who are in this state of bewilderment. They lost their orientation. So the easiest way to cope with the situation for them is just to stick to the governmental dogma and to say as little as possible to avoid conflicts. There is a very, very small number of those who are actively aggressive against Ukraine among the Russian population. It was never high in 2014. Probably it's even smaller now than 8 years ago. But the one thing should be made clear. The war in Ukraine is a patriotic war for the Ukrainians because they are, after all, a different people, although very, very culturally close to Russians and sharing a lot of common history. And of course, there are many mixed families across the border. Mm-hmm. This is should be really made very, very clear. On the other hand, what I see can be conceptualized as a second act of a major global political event which has by now lasted for 104 years and started in 1918 as the civil war in the collapsed Russian Empire. So this is a civil war equally important for the Russians and for the Ukrainians in terms of them belonging to a huge post-imperial East European space which did not succeed with the project of republicanism, building a free republic 104 years ago. And now Ukrainians are fighting in the front lines of those big populations. And they are doing that quite successfully. So the example for the Ukrainians is extremely important for the others, for the Russians and for the Belarusians.
Could success on the Ukrainian side spell the end of Vladimir Putin's regime, and could it be suicidal?
Well, there is a lot of talk that the success of the Ukrainians, their victory in this war, will immediately bring about a demise of the whole regime and the end of Vladimir Putin. I don't think it should be considered that easy. because the system of government in Russia is that of a mafia type. And mafia is not always extremely straightforward, and they always play with what is called impression management. They always think of trade-offs, and once they're defeated on one front, they will immediately start another front. So my argument as a sociologist is that the current war is not a fascist imperialist war. It's not a war about capturing territories, which would mean developing these territories. Instead, Putin is destroying everything. For what? For what reason? For symbolical reasons. Because for this type of political system, the symbolical struggle, the symbolical interaction is even more important than any physical advance. So once Russia is defeated, let's say being pushed back to the pre-February 24 lines, this does not necessarily mean the end of Putin, because he can always try and play with his media, with his propaganda, to explain to his people that that's exactly what we wanted, and that we defeated Nazism in Ukraine. So it will be another set of lies. So one should be prepared for that. On the other hand, you are right that this will create a totally new reality within the country. It's not in immediate process, of course. It takes some time for the Russians to start understand that the promise given to them is less than fulfilled, and even worse. They find themselves in a much worse situation than before.
Ukrainians have continually said that one of Vladimir Putin's goals in this war is to erase the notion, the idea of Ukrainian independence and nationhood, if you will, of the Ukrainian people.
More than that, the word genocide is being used.
Yes.
And it's sometimes justified. Indeed, what we are facing now reminds very vividly of the atrocities of the Second World War. And what Putin wants to do with Ukrainians may resemble what Hitler wanted to do with Jews. It's close to genocide. Maybe the scale is not yet the same, but we live in a totally different world now. We have different sensitivity, and people in the West now much faster understand the danger for the rest of the world, which is coming from a political system like Putin's, which is not necessarily fascist by ideology. You can't really call it the Russian government and Putin himself idealists. He has nothing of the kind. He doesn't have to offer to the rest of the world. It's not global communism. All he wants is to keep his power position within the country. And in order to create the necessary symbolic atmosphere for that, he, of course, started to develop this narrative of Ukrainians being ruled by some Nazis. But when this didn't work, the next logical step is, if the entire Ukrainian population is resisting, then they are all Nazis. It's not said aloud, but the action and the instructions to the army are exactly of that kind. So not only Ukrainians, but anyone who looks at this situation in terms of comparison with fascism, with German Nazism and the Second World War, they are right morally, although they are not right in terms of social analysis.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also the paradox that Russians are trying to protect, ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. We know that Russian is the language of choice. We also know that there are a lot of pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine. Yet these people are paying the heaviest price. In Mariupol, for example, I mean, there are estimates that more than 20,000 civilians may have been killed there. No one really knows quite yet, but if you look at the map and you look at the areas where the Russians are coming in and what they're doing, what Russian forces are doing to the villages and towns and cities and infrastructure there in the region, it's very difficult to, I don't know how Vladimir Putin is able to spin this to the Russian people that we have to kill these people to protect them.
Well, the constant lie and the control of the media does this job for him. so he knows what to do in that respect. He thinks that the majority of Russians will never know the truth about the Russians in Ukraine being killed. Of course, we see the reality here in Warsaw. The amount of Russian language spoken in the streets of Polish towns is now different, because the majority of these people who speak Russian in the streets of Warsaw are Russian speakers from that part of Ukraine. And of course, they're suffering the most. It's not quite true, I should correct you, that the majority, well, there are many Russian speakers or Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine who support Russia, are pro-Russian. I think there are very, very few left now. Practically none in those
yeah, I would say
territories.
that the events that have unfolded over the last three
Even
weeks
before
have-
that, throughout all these 8 years, what was going on in Donbass was a special operation. It was also a propaganda operation, brainwashing those few Russians who were ready to support Putin then. And then that number, it hasn't been checked, but it must have declined over years.
Right.
Otherwise, why Putin would take this action now?
Right, and that's if you look at the old front lines as well before this re-invasion, then it was also confined to a very small area. Well,
Yes.
we are at a time right now. Sergei, thank you very much for joining us on the program. I really appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for now here on World Today. Thank you for watching, everybody, and stay tuned for more here on TVP World.